Good evening, everyone. I guess I'm introducing myself, so I'm Father Paul, I'm your pastor. What's this? No, that's just going for it myself. It's my pulpit. I can do what I want, I guess. So, but when parish council was coming up with this idea, it was mentioned, and I realized I had quite a story to tell. Mine is a very personal story because it gets into a lot of what happened to me in my 3 years at St. Peter. And was a difficult topic for me to write about. I haven't really talked about it out loud at all, and really because I don't necessarily come out smelling like a bunch of roses. I think this is a story about the humanity of your priests, but also about the goodness of God and what grace looks like. I think it's a story, about how, practically speaking, forgiveness happens. I don't know if you've ever had a situation where, you've been really, really angry with somebody and you just don't know how you get from that point into real forgiveness. It's a story about that. It's also a story about how God works and transforms us through suffering. And so with that being said, I want to tell you about Father Jack Costello. Father Jack was he was a transplant from Chicago, and when he came to St. Louis, his home parish was St. Peter in Kirkwood. And then, when he was ordained a priest, he had a few assignments, but one of his assignments was being assigned for 6 years as the associate at St. Peter in Kirkwood. And then, at his very last parish assignment, he spent 16 years as the pastor of St. Peter in Kirkwood. 22, maybe 23 years of his priesthood, and he had 50 total years by the time he was done, was spent at that parish. Few pastors, as far as I know, have ever gotten to be pastor of their home parish like that. I think even fewer had so many years at one place, both as associate and as pastor. And I'll tell you what, he left his mark on the place. He was universally loved by the time he left. And that you could see that by the number of people who attended his funeral. It was the largest funeral that I've ever been in attendance for, except for somebody like Stan Musial, he was the king of his castle at St. Peter. But also, it's important to note that when I became associate pastor there, he was 72 years old, and retirement age for priests is 75. And so when I got there, it was this understanding that I was going to be his last associate pastor. It was the understanding that at the end of our 3 years together is that he was going to retire. He had all of these plans. He wanted to, be a tour guide in Rome. He loved Rome. He loved history, loved the history of Rome and Kirkwood and Ireland, and those were just his chief loves. And he talked about that very frequently. He wanted to own a condo, and he didn't really want to be retired in residence, because if you were in residence, you couldn't go to St. Peter in Kirkwood and be in residence there, because the next pastor who came along, could you imagine if the previous boss were there and he were living there, and the other guy was undoing some of your work, and so somebody would come up and just imagine what that would be like. And so, because he wasn't going to be at the St. Peter in Kirkwood, he rather had retired to a condo and simply joined the community. That was his dream. Well, anyway, Father Jack had many, many virtues, which I want to be able to talk about later. For one, he was a fantastic administrator and a fantastic pastor. And that's really only something that I was able to appreciate in hindsight when I became pastor myself, and I realized, wow, this is a hard job. And he did it really effortlessly. He was very good at what he did. But on top of that, Father Jack has, to the acknowledgement of many people who love him, he had one major flaw. And his major flaw just so happens to be the one thing that drives me crazy. And the flaw that he had is that he did not have a very good ability to regulate his emotions. And so what that would mean is that, maybe if most of us get angry, we have the ability of kind of like stepping back from the situation and maybe calming down a little bit and then coming back. And if we ever have to address the emotion, we can tell people that we are angry without showing that we are angry. Or we can tell people that we are happy, we can tell people that we're sad without showing those feelings. And so, but Father Jack did not really have a good ability to do that. As a matter of fact, it was kind of, if you are a priest, it's one of those things where how he wound up handling it for most of his priesthood is that he would go to a set of maybe 50 different parishioners, and he would, use a lot of them. He would spread the wealth, if you will, and he would be bothered about this, and he would go over here, and he would, just let off some steam, and then he would let off some steam over here. He would let off steam over here, and that's the way he was able to handle it. Just kind of looking ahead, I wonder what would happen if there was a global pandemic and your social life got crimped. So what ended up happening, though, is that I have known this about myself for a very long time, is that when I experience other people's anxiety, and that anxiety is about something that I am remotely anxious about myself, then I wind up getting really anxious. And the way I describe it inside, how I wind up feeling during those times, is that it's like I'm a lifeguard and there's somebody drowning out in the middle of a lake, and I swim out to rescue them. And what you have to do in order to get saved if you are the person who is drowning is you just have to relax and let the other person take you and swim you in. If you start trying to grab onto them, and if you still try to struggle, you wind up just pulling the lifeguard under. And what I feel like oftentimes when I am experiencing other people's anxiety about things that I'm anxious about is I feel like I am being drowned like a lifeguard. And so I maybe have told you the story before, just, when I was in seminary, there was a guy who, was really anxious watching the Blues game, and whenever that we would be tied or losing, he would just be shouting at the TV and everything like, well, the Blues are something that I am slightly anxious about, and so when that would be happening is I felt the need in those moments to calm him down. And why did I need him to calm down? Because if I didn't get him calmed down, I couldn't calm down. And so what ended up happening is on my very first day, full day at St. Peter, I just get finished putting the last of the things in my room together, and I walk out and I didn't see Father Jack, I heard Father Jack out in the courtyard. And to be as fair to him as possible, for the first 2 years before the pandemic, this was the worst that I ever saw. Is that Father Jack, there was some man who I did not know at the time and couldn't name since, and Father Jack was out there and he was screaming at this man. And I was so taken aback by this that I had to stop, and I actually had to ask myself, is Father Jack yelling at this man? Is this man being attacked by Father Jack? Or is Father Jack just, are they on the same side and he's just really animated and he's telling this person about something? And so I stopped to listen, because if he were yelling at him, I would have had to have intervened. And what I figured out after listening to him is that they were just both in agreement about something, but Father Jack had just lost his cool over it. And I remember feeling that feeling inside and just seeing his anxiety, and I just felt like in that moment that I was the lifeguard and I was being pulled under. And so, and then in my first, if you remember the history of St. Louis or the history of the United States at that time, there were a few other things that were happening in my life and in the life of in the country at the time. And one is that one of my closest friends was dying of cancer at the time. So I'm already struggling very much, I only have so much emotional energy at this point. But the other thing that was happening at that time was that the Philadelphia report for the priest abuse scandals from the 1960s up and through 2000, it came out, and there were all sorts of priests from the 1960s through the 1980s who they named them as credible abuse claims. And Father Jack, who lived through 2002 as a priest and had some apparently very bad experiences of people, treating him very badly, what do you think he wound up starting to act like at that point? Is that he was not able in that time to emotionally self-regulate. And so at the very beginning of my time with him, actually, I wound up seeing the very worst of Father Jack, and it was something that bothered me more than anything. And I remember, in my first 2 years, eventually, Father Jack was able to mellow out. The priest abuse thing kind of calmed down. I started recovering from the, situation with my friend. I started to get to know why Father Jack, when he got animated, I started to figure out different ways of, kind of leaving the situation, and making sure that I wasn't around when he was doing that and things like that. But another thing that I had to learn how to do at the time is, because I was the person living in the house with him, is that if I was the only person around, who do you think that he would use to self-regulate? And so I had to I had to set some very firm boundaries on what that would look like, and some, just limit the amount of time. But as 2 years were starting to go on, I really began to like Father Jack. I began to appreciate him for who he was. I wound up seeing a lot of his good qualities. And then the pandemic hit. And the pandemic, for me, being an introvert, and things were really locked down in St. Peter, this was just glorious for me. I started praying in the morning. I would go and I would say Mass. I would get some reading in. I had this book list that I got through. I think I got through 50 books in the entire year and everything like that. And I had this plan of life. I would go out and exercise. I would call up some friends. I would, be involved. We were doing a lot of fun things in youth ministry, like creative things to be active during the pandemic. And things seemed like they were actually going fairly well for me, except that Father Jack was not doing all that well. And what would end up happening was, because Father Jack, once again, lost his support group around him, is that I would hear him and he would be on the phone in his room and he would be, I would say, confiding loudly with that person about what was going on in his life. And what ended up happening, and then he would kind of corner me and he would just start talking about these things. And once again, it's the lifeguard thing. I feel like I'm kind of drowning in it. And so I wound up really, after about a month of doing this, I came to realize that I was really starting to get angry at the situation. The boundaries that I had set in place weren't working. He was, really starting to get a little bit out of control. He was almost inconsolable, and his inconsolability was making me inconsolable. And I remember at one point, I just hit a real rock bottom. And I said to myself, God, I cannot live in this situation anymore. I need some help. What can I do? What needs to happen differently? Do I need to find a different parish assignment? Do I need to, what do I do to get out of this, because I can't do this anymore? And I brought this to prayer 2 days, and on the second day, God gave me an answer to my prayer, which was one of those things that when God speaks to me, it's often very simple and it's often in my own voice. But it couldn't have been from me, because it was a brand new thought to me. And the thought was this: at least Father Jack, when he is freaking out about a global pandemic. You are freaking out about him freaking out. Whose freak out is more irrational? And it was one of these moments where it was like a lightning bolt struck me, and I'm like, where did that come from? That wasn't very nice, God. But, God, the only way he can start to help us is if he tells us the truth. And so what he then, and I've been trying to struggle for a moment, because I wound up over the next 2 months of prayer trying to come to a realization, coming to an understanding of my own situation and my own reactions. And I've never had to put this in words up to this point, but I want to struggle to try to do this now. And here's kind of what I learned, is that I realized that the significance of what the events were going on at the time. Yes, the pandemic was a big problem. Yes, the pandemic was something that globally people were concerned about, and yet there were very many people who could be concerned about the pandemic and yet not have a very strong emotional reaction to it. And Father Jack, on the other hand, of course, he was one of the people that from the outside, I saw how he was reacting, and other people, by the way, saw how he was reacting, and they were like, I wish I could help this person. I wish I could help them so that he could just handle this with a bit of calm and a bit of peace. But for whatever reason, this was just his kryptonite. But then I looked at my situation and I said, isn't it the same with all sorts of other things in life? Some people, they struggle with figuring out what their vocation is going to be in life. And they just wrestle with it. It's just the crisis until they figure out what the next thing they're to do with their life is. And some people just shrug their shoulders. and think it's not a big deal if I don't know right now. I'll figure it out later. Some people, like if something breaks down, their car breaks down, they just lose it. Or somebody cuts them off on the highway. Other people, it just doesn't bother them. And so I wound up kind of seeing myself from the outside, and I said, I wonder if people could see my freakouts, how I'm responding internally to Father Jack. If that were expressed out loud, I wonder if people would see me the same way. That it's really not that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. But here's maybe a second way of looking at that, is that I was not the only person at St. Peter who realized that Father Jack was having these freakouts and was not necessarily pleased that they were happening. In fact, many people at St. Peter knew this character flaw, acknowledged this character flaw, but loved him anyway. They were able to see in the midst of that all of his good qualities, all of his many virtues, and this one bad quality, yes, it was a bad quality, but it was only small part of who Father Jack was. And when they talked about him otherwise, they spoke of him glowingly. And I started to look at my own reactions, and I was saying that this is such a big deal for me, is that I'm beginning to see this is the only thing in Father Jack that I'm able to see. And so once again, it was trying to learn to step outside of myself and asking myself the question, am I hyper-focusing on something, or is there something, am I missing a bigger picture? And maybe a third way of saying it is that, and this is maybe one of the harder things to say in this situation, is maybe the things that I was freaking out about weren't actually real. Now, I want to qualify this really quickly, because this is maybe the hardest thing that I'm going to talk about tonight. It's the one I struggle to articulate really the most. But what I mean to say is, I don't mean to say that there was no global pandemic out in the world. I'm not trying to say that there's nothing to be concerned about anybody's behavior when it is something that annoys us. I'm just saying that, because those are all real problems. Those are all real issues. But what I realized was that the emotional energy, because other people didn't necessarily have it, it was something that I, in particular, was the one who was bringing to the problem. It was not caused by the global pandemic, Father Jack's reactions, any more than my reaction was caused by Father Jack. No, Father Jack's reaction to the pandemic was mainly coming from within inside of him. And my reaction to Father Jack was coming from within inside of me. And so in that moment, what God was telling me is that maybe I am the problem, and Father Jack is not the problem at all. The way that I am choosing to react in this situation is the real problem. And so here it wound up becoming after, finally, I hope that made sense, because, it's meant a whole lot to me. And what I wound up having a challenge, setting a goal for myself during COVID. And my question was, can I learn to see Father Jack the way that his parishioners who love him deeply see him? Can I learn to see this behavior, yes, as annoying, but not let it ruin my day? And as an objective goal, like to have an objective measure to see if I'm making progress, I would say that can I learn if, rather than seeing Father Jack and having one of his reactions ruin my day, could I maybe only get it down to ruining the next 3 hours? Or could I get it down to that it's only ruining the next hour? What if I could get it down that it was only bothering me for 5 minutes? And that was what my goal was, is to learn, how do I get back to that point? And I want to say, brothers and sisters, is that was a very difficult thing for me to do, because I had already had months of having bad thought processes, which were basically feeding this emotion over and over again. But let me tell you about how I eventually was able to start getting beyond that. And the first thing that I learned in that time is that we actually do have control about how we feel. We don't have control over our initial reactions to things. So if I see somebody kicking a homeless person on the street, I am going to have a reaction of anger towards that, whether I like it or not. If there is something that really bothers me or really makes me sad, or if somebody does something that is really frightening, at first, I'm going to have that reaction. But after that initial reaction, Whether we continue to have that emotion or not depends on how we wind up thinking about it, how we choose to view what happened. And so what I would do is every time I would see Father Jack having one of these reactions and I would find myself getting, just all bent out of shape, is I would say to myself, this isn't about Father Jack. This is about you. And I told myself this over and over and over again. My mantra was, your reaction to this is not real. In other words, it's not something that exists in Father Jack, it exists in you. And I wound up telling myself that over and over and over again, and it actually started to have some effect. But the next thing that I learned about this is that I reminded myself that I was the problem. I reminded myself that the emotional energy was mine that I was bringing to the situation. But then what I decided to do was that if I were going to change my thought processes, I said, what if I started trying to list out Father Jack's good qualities so that whenever I wound up angry with him, I could have all of those opinions that other people, that really loved Father Jack, and I could say, this is just one bad part of him. And that he's really a good person, a good priest, and a good man. And at first what I did, I don't know if you've ever tried to do an exercise like this before, because, like when you're really struggling with somebody, and the first things you write on the list are those begrudging things. Well, I guess he's a good pastor. I guess he's this. I guess he's that. But it was one of those things that after a while, I came to the realization, I am only going to put something on this list if at some point I feel real particular gratitude towards him, if I really mean it. But then what I ended up doing after that, it was a really good exercise, is that I went around to some of Father Jack's best friends, didn't tell him a thing of what I was experiencing at the time, and I just said to him, Father Jack's getting ready to retire, and he's been here for a long time. Can you tell me what it is that you love about Father Jack so much? And I'll tell you what, these stories that I heard about that man were just heartwarming. I heard stories of people who said Father Jack was one of the most excited people when he was doing the sacraments, and by the way, he was. And the number of people that I heard say that I just came to the church to get my kid baptized, I wasn't involved in the church at all, but I saw that man's enthusiasm, I saw that man's love for God, and it just drew me in, and I'm here today in church because of Father Jack. I heard him say, I heard people talk about what a good administrator he was, what a good boss he was to work for. I heard people talk about how he went out of their way for him, for funerals, the amount of time that he spent on a situation. Not only that, I heard people say that he always knows everybody in my family's names. He had a really great knack for names. When he would drive the neighborhoods, he didn't just know Kirkwood very well, the landscape. He knew the houses where people lived. And if you ever passed different places, he would point out, that's where so-and-so lives, and that's where so-and-so lives, and here's when they moved in this area. He knew where everybody was. He was a shepherd who knew his sheep by name. And so what ended up happening was I started to make a list, not only of the things that I saw good in Father Jack, I started making a list of things that other people loved about him as well. And you know what actually started to happen at that point? As I started to love those things too. But then the last thing that I started doing is that rather than taking my own reactions to what was going on so seriously, I started asking myself, just out of curiosity, why is he reacting the way that he is right now? Rather than focusing on my own internal reactions, just out of curiosity, I started to pay attention to him and to see what it was that he was so upset about. And as the time started to go on, I realized that this man was living through some real tragedy at the moment. The year that the pandemic happened he was 74 years old. He was going to retire in June. And this year of COVID was supposed to be his triumphant exit from St. Peter, the parish that he had been pastor at for 22 or 23 years. And he was expecting to be able to do all of those things the last time and to have the parishioners say, and this is going to be the last time that Father Jack celebrates Christmas at this parish. This is going to be the last time that he celebrates the Easter Vigil. This is going to be the last time he does this. This is going to be the last time he does this. And what ended up happening was that entire year through September or October, there was nothing going on at the parish. And he just experienced it as a very great loss. But then there were other things that were happening. In the middle of all of this work that I was trying to do with Father Jack, there was this point where he lost it with somebody on the parking lot, and I was about to fall off the wagon. I was about to come and correct him. It was not going to be good. But when I walked in, God gave me a grace in that moment. And the grace was that Father Jack's dog had just had a surgery on his back, and he had just gotten back from the hospital. Caleb, a basset hound. He loved basset hounds. And what ended up happening was that dog was laying on the floor, and it was just moaning. It was, crying, whimpering, and everything. And Father Jack was standing over that dog with tears coming down his eyes because that dog was suffering, and he had no idea how to help it. And I remember, because I'm a lot more calm person, I think, in those situations. It's a good quality that I have. And I remember looking at the dog, and Father Jack, we went into the kitchen and opened a cabinet, and it was the cabinet where the dog's food was. And as soon as he heard the cabinet open, he started drooling. And I said, "Father Jack, when's the last time you fed this dog?" And he said, "Well, it's been about 8 hours." And I'm like, "Why don't you try feeding your dog?" And he went and fed his dog, and I just saw, he just said, "Thank you, Father, or Paul, thank you so much." I couldn't figure out what to do. And it was one of these moments, once again, of seeing the humanity of Father Jack and seeing some of his own suffering, realizing that he was going through his things too. But then in August, he had gone into to the doctor's office because he was having some trouble with his bladder flow. And what ended up happening was, to make a long story short, is that the doctors missed some pretty obvious signs of prostate cancer. And they had done some different things to, that seemed to work in the short term, but when January was coming around, he was still having these problems. It was starting to make it difficult for him to sleep. And so there was this fateful day in my life and in his, February 12th, 2021. And on that day, I wake up, and it's a morning like any other morning, and at 10 o'clock in the morning, the cleaning lady arrived, and I always started with the retired associate, Father Greg's room first, and I get this rapid knock on my door, and the cleaning lady is crying, and she says, "Father Greg is on the floor, and he's naked, and he's like foggy in the brain and everything." And so I go into the room, and Father Greg, our retired associate, maybe 83 years old, is on the ground just as she described him. And so in hindsight, you just often aren't thinking necessarily clearly in emergency situations. I should have just called the paramedics right there, but seeing him in that state, I worked on getting him up. I got him in a chair, I got him dressed and everything, and at this time I'm 40 minutes late for a funeral prep meeting, and so I go to the funeral prep meeting, and I come back, and the staff is all gathered around, and they're talking animatedly, and Father Jack is back. He was gone all morning, and so I pulled Father Jack aside, and I start saying to him, "Father Jack, here's what's happening. Here's the things I was seeing with Father Greg and everything like that," and as I'm talking, I'm just realizing he's not listening at all. He's waiting for me to shut up, and so I stop talking, and he says, "I have prostate cancer." Within a matter of 90 minutes, St. Peter and Kirkwood Parish went from having 3 priests down to 1. And in that time, Father Jack, he just, once again, was beside himself. And it was one of those areas of him being beside himself that with all of his anxiety and everything like that, even I could see it immediately what it was that this man was going through. And so what ended up happening at that point was, the rest of my 4 months at St. Peter was just a whirlwind. But I remember I went to my first pastor, Monsignor Mark Ulrich at Sacred Heart in Florissant, and I started telling him about his cancer. He knew a lot of my struggles with Father Jack. He knew a lot of my story. And after I told him about the cancer, he actually took me in by the shoulders, like he does when he's really serious. And he says, "Look, Paul, I was praying about this recently, and this cancer diagnosis has just made me realize that this is exactly what God wants you to hear right now, and so I need you to listen up." And he said, "I want you, over the course of the next 4 months, to kill Father Jack with love." And he said, "I know that's going to be difficult. I know that, it's very difficult for you to sit and to listen to him when he's anxious and everything like that. I know all that story. I know everything. But this is a man who is suffering in this moment and in this time, and you need to at least try to be there for him." And so what ended up happening is that I was working 60-hour, 80-hour weeks every single week, trying to do the jobs of all, that needed to be done. And what happened is I would be exhausted at the end of the day. And I would come in and I would start having conversations with Father Jack. And it was just like it was still as draining as ever for me. It was still as hard for me to hear as ever because I still felt like I was drowning. But I would sit and I would listen to him. But I would say also, brothers and sisters, as I was no saint in this situation, there would be times when I knew that he was going to be in his room and I passed by another direction because I just didn't have the energy to do with it. But in that moment, there was something that changed and something that was different at that time. Because every time that I walked by, I said, this is an opportunity that you have where you could be giving him something which he could genuinely use. And it was one of those times that rather than, setting boundaries with him, it was God telling me, you're not perfect either. You have your own flaws too. What ended up happening then at the very end is Father Jack, retired the day before I left. And Father Jack, when he found out that I was coming to St. Francis of Assisi, he became very animated. He became very happy and proud of me, and I could see the pride in his eyes. And he said to me, Father, I want to recommend you a practice that I have done at every parish that I have been pastor at. My first day at the parish, or your first day at the parish, I want you, late at night, when nobody is around, I want you to go into church, and I want you to prostrate yourself in front of the altar. And I want you to pray that you will be a good servant and a good priest for your people. And it's one of those things, he said, I've done this at every assignment, and I would ask you to do the same. And sure enough, so my first day as pastor, at St. Francis, I got right down here, and I'm not nearly as sentimental as Father Jack was. I probably had about 5 seconds of emotion, and afterwards I was like, this is kind of awkward. And yet at the same time, it was something I think I'm going to continue to do because it is something that one of the most beloved priests that I have ever met by his people, it is something that he did. And I feel that I would like to do the same. What ended up happening as time started to go on, and as I kind of got some distance from the situation, and I was able to see things in hindsight, the only things that I really remembered about Father Jack in the end were his good qualities. It was amazing how the bad stuff sometimes just disappears in hindsight, and maybe that was a moment of saying that, the stuff that I was doing was helping, the different ways I was doing of handling it, but in November of 2021, I saw in my emails that they were going to do a prayer service for Father Jack. They were going to do it at St. Peter, and Father Mike Eswine, who was his associate pastor at St. Peter for 12 years, was going to lead the service. They were going to do the Chaplet of Divine Mercy, and they prayed, this out loud, and then Father Mike laid his hands on Father Jack, and the people of St. Peter were extending their hands out over him and praying a blessing for him, for healing, for comfort, for strength, for God's grace. And what happened in that moment, I witnessed it, and I saw what was going on the outside, but Father Jack later told me and several other people, he said, it was in that moment that I realized cancer was my friend. What I realized in that moment is that if it weren't for this, I would have had to have spent 2 or 3 years away from St. Peter to let the next pastor get acclimated, to let him kind of get himself settled before I came back. Because of my cancer, I never had to leave. And it's because of my cancer in this moment that I am surrounded by such love. And so for him, it was one of those things that in the end, it was that moment where he realized it was his cancer that was able to make him experience the true love of his own parishioners. Final story, my final conversation that I ever had with Father Jack was on February 12th, so it was a year after his cancer diagnosis. And it was a big day for me, so it was burned into my memory, but I called him up on that day and I said, hey, I've been thinking about you today and your cancer diagnosis, and I just wanted to know, I was praying for you and I wanted to see how you were doing. And I got his voicemail, and then he called me back, and he was so grateful for that conversation, and he said, it was very strange to me because it took me getting cancer to realize that the global pandemic wasn't all that big of a deal. Isn't that a funny thing to say? Because that's what he was afraid of in the first place, is that he was so afraid of death. But when he actually really confronted death face to face, all of the things that were important before then, that he thought were important, that really weren't, faded away and disappeared. Isn't it funny that Father Jack and I, even though we were such different people, that our stories were the exact same, that we really learned the same lesson, that God gave us both the same graces for our own individual problems? What ended up happening after that was that Father Jack and I were scheduled to get together. I was going to go visit his condo, and we were going to, just shoot the breeze and everything like that. And a week before I was able to get there, Father Jack passed away, and I never got to have that conversation with him. But you know what? It was one of those things. It was almost like in that moment, God was saying, "My work is done," because I remember the week before, and when I was anticipating it, I realized just how much I was looking forward to having that conversation with him. That at that particular time, I was looking forward to, even if he was losing his cool, I was looking forward to being able to sit there with him. And maybe what God was saying to me when he wound up dying was, okay, you weren't able to do it for Father Jack, but there are going to be many other Father Jacks in this world. Will you be able to be my servant for the next one that comes along? And so what would end up happening is now, even to this day, when I see those kinds of anxious people in front of me, the first thought that comes to my mind is Father Jack, and I remind myself to treat this person in front of me with dignity and respect. And so, brothers and sisters, just I guess to close off this talk is that I guess I learned a few things during the pandemic. And I guess one of the first things was I learned a lot about myself and what sets me off and everything like that. I learned quite a bit about forgiveness. I also learned that in the face of death, in the end, death is something that winds up putting things in perspective. Both for Father Jack, it put things in perspective, and it put them in perspective for me as well. To the point where when Father Jack finally died and passed from this world, the stuff that I went through almost doesn't even seem real anymore. It seems like all of the stuff that Father Jack, like those, whatever bad qualities he had, I know for a fact that he is in heaven right now, and I know for a fact he doesn't have those bad qualities anymore. I know the only thing that is left is the priest that was beloved at St. Peter. Only the good qualities remain, to the point where when I finally get all of my bad qualities removed from me on this earth, and I finally see God face to face in heaven, I realize that I will be seeing Father Jack up there, and I actually hope he's one of the first people to greet me. Because just as Father Jack realized that cancer was his friend, what I realized in this entire situation was Father Jack's my friend too. Thank you. them bread from heaven. Let us pray. Lord Jesus Christ, who have given us the Eucharist as the memorial of your suffering and death, may our worship of the sacrament of your body and blood help us to experience the salvation you want for us.